Sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with swords, but with the quiet dignity of a man who refuses to be broken. In the great hall of Fjallvik, where firelight cast long shadows and ale flowed freely, Jarl Thrain presented a mysterious iron box to his gathered warriors. The southern traders who brought it claimed it held great treasure, but none could open its strange lock. When the Jarl spotted Orm Stenfist, a massive warrior seeking shelter from the storm, he saw an opportunity for sport. "Open this," Thrain announced with a laugh, "and all the gold within is yours." The hall roared with amusement at the impossible challenge. Everyone knew Orm as a man of brute strength, not delicate skill. But as the giant knelt beside the box, his weathered hands moved with unexpected gentleness. What forgotten memories would guide his fingers to unlock more than just treasure? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The storm had been raging for 3 days when Orm Stenfist first appeared at the gates of Fjallvik. Through the driving rain and howling wind, the guards could barely make out his massive silhouette against the lightning-split sky. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his broad shoulders draped in a sodden bearskin cloak that had seen countless battles. Water streamed from his iron-grey beard, and his pale blue eyes held the distant look of a man who had walked too many blood-soaked fields. Fjallvik perched on the edge of the world, where jagged cliffs met the endless grey of the northern sea. The settlement had grown around Jarl Thrain's great hall, a timber fortress that commanded the coastal approaches for leagues in either direction. Here, where the wind never ceased its mournful song and the salt spray left everything touched by the sea's bitter kiss, hard men made hard choices to survive another winter. The hall itself spoke of prosperity earned through strength and cunning. Carved dragon heads crowned its peaks, their eyes seeming to follow visitors as they approached. Inside, the walls were hung with shields and weapons taken from fallen enemies, while the long tables bore the scars of countless feasts and the occasional drawn blade. The central fire pit threw dancing shadows, across faces weathered by salt wind and marked by the small scars that came from a life lived always ready for. Battle Orm had arrived with nothing but his weapons and a worn leather satchel that he kept close to his side. The guards who admitted him noted how his massive hands, scarred from years of gripping sword hilts and shield rims, seemed to unconsciously trace patterns in the air as he waited, as if his fingers remembered motions his mind had long forgotten. Inside the hall, Jarl Thrain held court with the easy confidence of a man who had never met a challenge he couldn't face with steel or silver. At 45, he still possessed the broad shoulders and quick reflexes that had made him feared in his youth. Though silver now threaded his dark hair, and his face bore the lines of a leader who carried the weight of his people's survival on his shoulders. His deep voice carried easily over the storm's rage, spinning tales and settling disputes with the wisdom that came from 3 decades of command. Beside him sat his daughter Astrid, a woman of 26, whose beauty was matched only by her sharp mind. Where other jarls might have married off such a daughter to cement alliances, Thrain had recognized something in his child that reminded him of his own fierce independence. Her auburn hair caught the firelight as she listened to her father's stories, but her green eyes often wandered to study the faces around her, reading the subtle currents of ambition and loyalty that flowed beneath the surface of every gathering. Elder Gunnar occupied his traditional place at Thrain's right hand, his ancient face a map of 8 decades spent watching the world change. His white beard fell nearly to his belt, and his gnarled hands moved constantly over the carved staff that had become his constant companion since his warrior days ended. Those who dismissed him as merely an old man telling stories had never seen the sharp intelligence that still gleamed in his eyes, or noticed how young warriors unconsciously leaned forward when he spoke of the old ways. Among the other warriors gathered around the fire, Bjorn Ironskull stood out for his restless energy and barely contained ambition. Younger than most at 28, he had earned his place through skill with an axe and an aggressive confidence that some called courage and others called recklessness. His dark eyes constantly measured the other men around him, always seeking the angle that might elevate his standing in the Jarl's estimation. When Orm was finally granted entry, the great hall fell into the kind of silence that comes when something unusual breaks the familiar rhythm of daily life. His reputation had preceded him, whispered stories of a giant who fought like a berserker but spoke like a monk, who could split a man from crown to groin with a single axe stroke, but who often spent entire days without uttering a word. Some called him Stenfist because his punches could shatter stone. Others claimed the name came from his habit of standing motionless as a boulder during battle, unmoved by the chaos around him. "Welcome, Orm Stenfist," Thrain called out, his voice carrying the formal courtesy due to a warrior of reputation. The storm drives many to seek shelter, but few arrive with such renowned shadow following behind them. Orm inclined his massive head in acknowledgement, drops of rain still falling from his beard to the rushes scattered across the floor. "Jarl Thrain," he rumbled, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of a man who chose his words with care. "I seek only shelter until the storm passes, and perhaps news of the southern roads." "Granted, and gladly," Thrain replied, gesturing toward an empty space on one of the long benches. "But first, you arrive at a fortuitous moment. We have here a puzzle that has entertained us these past 2 days." As if summoned by his words, 2 thralls carried forward the iron box that would soon command every eye in the hall. It was unlike anything the northern craftsmen produced. Sleek where their work was rough, intricate where theirs was simple. The metal had been worked with techniques none of them recognized, shaped into curves and angles that seemed to flow like water made solid. At its heart lay a lock mechanism so complex that even describing it challenged the limits of their language. "Southern traders brought this 3 days past," Thrain continued, running his fingers along its smooth surface. "They claimed it holds enough gold to buy a longship, complete with crew and provisions for a year's raiding. Yet for all their boasting, they could not open it themselves. Said the key was lost long ago, and the mechanism too delicate for any but the most skilled hands. The box was perhaps 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, and as deep as a man's forearm. Its surface bore engravings so fine they seemed to have been drawn rather than carved, spirals and geometric patterns that drew the eye into their depths. The lock itself appeared to be made of different metal than the box, darker and somehow more substantial, as if it had been crafted to last beyond the lifetime of kingdoms. "I have offered this challenge to every man in my service," Thrain announced, his eyes twinkling with the anticipation of entertainment. "Open this box and claim what lies within. Yet so far it has proven as stubborn as a maiden's virtue and twice as well defended." Laughter rippled around the hall, though more than one warrior shifted uncomfortably. The box had indeed resisted every attempt at opening. Some had tried brute force, attacking it with hammers and axes, until Thrain called them off for fear they would damage whatever lay within. Others had attempted to pick the lock with knives and awls, but the mechanism seemed designed to resist such crude approaches. Orm studied the box from his seat, his pale eyes taking in details that others had missed. Where they saw only an impossible challenge, his gaze traced the flow of the metalwork, the way certain elements seemed designed to move in harmony rather than opposition. His right hand, hanging at his side, unconsciously mimicked the motions his eyes suggested, a gentle pressure here. "A careful turn there. You seem intrigued by our puzzle, Stenfist," Astrid observed, her voice carrying the musical quality that made even hardened warriors pause to listen. "Do you fancy yourself clever with such devices?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the central fire. Around the hall, conversations quieted as men leaned forward to hear his response. This was more than idle curiosity. In a world where reputation meant the difference between respect and dismissal, how a warrior responded to challenges spoke to his very nature. Orm's weathered hands rested on his knees as he considered his words. Those hands had wrapped around sword hilts for more than 30 years, had dealt death to enemies whose names were forgotten and whose faces had blurred into the grey haze of countless battles. Yet now, looking at the intricate device before him, they seemed to remember old emotions, gentler purposes. "I know something of metal and its ways," he said finally, his deep voice carrying carefully chosen words. "Though it has been many years since such knowledge served any purpose." In his lap, the worn leather satchel seemed to grow heavier, as if the tools within had stirred to life at his admission. He had carried them through every campaign, every battle, telling himself they were merely practical items, small hammers for repairing weapons, thin chisels for adjusting armor, files for maintaining edges. Yet deep in his heart, he knew they were something more, remnants of a life he had abandoned, skills he had buried beneath layers of necessary violence. His father's voice echoed across the decades, patient and sure. "Metal speaks to those who know how to listen, my son. Force tells it what to do, but understanding asks what it wishes to become." The memory brought with it the scent of coal smoke and hot iron, the rhythm of hammer on anvil, the satisfaction of watching raw ore transform into something beautiful and useful under skilled hands. But those memories belonged to a different man, a younger Orm who had believed the world could be shaped through patience and craft, rather than conquered through strength and fear. "Then perhaps you would honor us with an attempt," Thrain suggested, though his tone carried the weight of formal challenge rather than casual invitation. "If you succeed where others have failed, the treasure within is yours. If you fail, well, you join distinguished company in that failure." Around the hall, the assembled warriors watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Bjorn's face wore a slight sneer, his dark eyes suggesting he would welcome the chance to watch the famous Stenfist humbled by a simple box. Others leaned forward with genuine interest, eager to see what approach the legendary warrior might take. Orm felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing, pressing down on his shoulders with familiar heaviness. How many times had he stood before groups of men, feeling their expectations and judgments? How many battles had he fought not just against enemies, but against the limitations others sought to impose upon him? Yet this moment felt different. The box seemed to call to something deeper than his warrior's instincts, something that had slumbered for decades beneath the accumulated calluses of violence and survival. As his eyes traced its elegant lines once more, he found himself remembering not the weight of a sword in his hands, but the balanced heft of his father's favorite hammer, the way it seemed to become an extension of his arm when the work was flowing well. "I will make the attempt," Orm said at last, rising from his bench with the fluid grace that had kept him alive through countless battles. "Though I make no promises beyond giving it the attention such fine work deserves." The hall erupted in murmurs of anticipation as he approached the box, his massive frame seeming to dwarf the delicate device. Yet as he knelt beside it, something in his posture suggested reverence rather than domination, as if he approached not an opponent to be conquered, but a teacher from whom he might learn. His weathered fingers hovered just above the lock's surface, not quite touching, but close enough to feel the coolness of the metal. In that suspended moment, 30 years of carefully constructed identity hung in the balance, waiting to see which man would emerge. The warrior the world knew, or the craftsman his father had trained. The lock mechanism gleamed in the firelight like a living thing, its surface catching and reflecting the dancing flames in ways that made it seem almost alive. As Orm knelt beside the box, the familiar ache in his knees reminded him of the decades that had passed since he had last approached any task with such careful attention. The lock was unlike anything he had seen in the northern lands, a masterwork of precision that spoke of traditions and techniques passed down through generations of master craftsmen. "Well then, giant," Bjorn called from his place near the fire, his voice carrying the edge of mockery that had become his signature. "Will you take an axe to it like the rest of us? Perhaps your great strength can accomplish what skill has not." Orm ignored the taunt, his attention focused entirely on the device before him. The lock consisted of multiple rings of different metals, each bearing intricate symbols that seemed to shift and flow in the flickering light. Some rings could rotate freely, while others appeared fixed in place, creating a puzzle that required understanding rather than force. At its center lay a mechanism so complex that merely looking at it made most men's eyes water from the effort of trying to follow its interconnected parts. As his fingers hovered just above the metal surface, something stirred in the depths of his memory. The scent of hot iron and coal smoke filled his nostrils, though the hall held only the familiar aromas of burning wood and roasted meat. For a moment he was 7 years old again, standing on a wooden stool beside his father's anvil, watching those patient hands shape raw metal into things of beauty and purpose. "See how the iron speaks to us, my son," his father's voice whispered across the years, gentle and sure as summer rain. "Every piece of metal has its own nature, its own desires. Our task is not to force it into submission, but to understand what it wishes to become and help it achieve that form." The memory brought with it a cascade of others, each one as vivid as if it had happened yesterday rather than decades past. He remembered the weight of his first hammer, so carefully sized to fit his young hands. He recalled the satisfaction of his first successful joint, the way two pieces of metal had flowed together as if they had always been meant as one. Most clearly, he remembered his father's teaching about locks, not the crude mechanisms of the North, but the delicate puzzles created by masters who viewed each device as a test of understanding rather than strength. "A lock," his father had explained, demonstrating with a practice piece he had crafted for teaching, "is a conversation between the maker and the one who would open it. The maker asks questions through the mechanism. Do you understand balance? Can you feel the difference between resistance and obstruction? Will you listen to what the metal tells you, or will you try to force your will upon it?" The lesson had seemed abstract then, a philosophical exercise that held little relevance to the practical work of shaping horseshoes and mending plows. Yet now, kneeling before this southern masterwork, Orm understood that his father had been preparing him for this very moment. His weathered fingers finally made contact with the lock's surface, and immediately he felt the difference between this mechanism and the crude devices he knew. The metal was not merely cold. It was alive with potential energy, each component precisely balanced against the others. Where northern locks relied on simple sliding bolts and basic springs, this device operated on principles of harmony and balance that turned the act of opening into a form of communication. "He hesitates," someone murmured from the watching crowd. Though Orm paid no attention to the whispered commentary, his entire world had narrowed to the lock before him, to the subtle vibrations he could feel through his fingertips as he gently explored its surface. The first ring bore symbols that reminded him of flowing water, each mark carefully positioned to indicate the direction of rotation. As he turned it slowly, feeling for the moment of perfect alignment, he became aware of a soft clicking sound, not the harsh snap of a spring under tension, but something more musical, as if the mechanism sang when properly operated. Around the hall, the mood shifted from casual entertainment to genuine curiosity. Even Bjorn fell silent as he watched the giant's unexpectedly delicate touch, the way Orm's massive hands moved with a precision that seemed impossible for fingers scarred by countless battles. Astrid leaned forward in her chair, her green eyes bright with interest, as she observed this transformation of the legendary warrior into something altogether different. The second ring proved more challenging, its symbols arranged in patterns that seemed to shift and change as he studied them. Here his father's lessons about patience became crucial. Where another man might have tried to force the mechanism, Orm waited, allowing his eyes to adjust to the patterns, letting his mind process the visual puzzle at its own pace. "Listen to what it tells you," he whispered to himself, echoing his father's patient instruction. "Force creates resistance, but understanding creates cooperation." The words carried clearly in the hushed hall, and more than one warrior shifted uncomfortably at hearing such philosophical language from a man they knew only as a dealer of death. Elder Gunnar, however, sat straighter in his chair, his ancient eyes sharpening with recognition. Something in Orm's approach, in the reverent way he handled the device, stirred memories of other craftsmen, other times when skill mattered more than strength. The second ring yielded with a sound like silver bells, its rotation smooth as silk, despite the complexity of the mechanism it controlled. Orm felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the potential treasure within the box, and everything to do with the simple joy of understanding how things worked. This was the feeling he had lost all those years ago when he traded his father's tools for a warrior's weapons. When he chose survival over calling, the third ring brought with it a flood of memory so intense that his hands stilled on the mechanism. He was 12 years old, working beside his father on a commission from the Jarl himself, a ceremonial sword that would become an heirloom passed down through generations. The work required not just skill, but artistry, the ability to see beyond the immediate task to its deeper significance. "Some work endures beyond our lifetime," his father had said, his voice heavy with the knowledge of his own mortality. "These are the pieces that test not just our skill, but our understanding of what it means to create rather than destroy. When you work on such things, you must remember that your hands serve something greater than your own immediate needs." The memory brought with it the crushing weight of loss. The day when raiders had come, and his father had died, defending the forge that represented his life's work. Orm had been away, trading iron for grain in a distant village, and by the time he returned, nothing remained but ashes and memories. That night, he had buried his tools with his father's body and taken up the sword, choosing the path that led to survival rather than the one that led to beauty. Yet here, 30 years later, the lock seemed to offer him a chance at redemption. As his fingers found the third ring's proper alignment, he felt something click into place that had nothing to do with mechanism and everything to do with identity. Perhaps it was not too late. Perhaps the craftsman his father had trained still lived beneath the warrior's scars. The watching crowd had grown completely silent, their attention focused entirely on the gentle sounds of metal moving in perfect harmony. Even the storm outside seemed to have paused, as if the very elements waited to see whether this impossible challenge would finally be met. Astrid found herself holding her breath as she watched Orm work. This was not the same man who had entered their hall seeking shelter from the storm. Where that man had carried himself with the weary resignation of a professional killer, this man moved with purpose and precision that spoke of deep understanding. Her father might have intended this as entertainment, but she was beginning to suspect they were witnessing something far more significant. The fourth ring resisted his initial attempts, its mechanism more complex than the others. Here the symbols seemed to reference astronomical concepts, star patterns, and celestial movements that required not just manual skill but intellectual understanding. Orm paused, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to decode the puzzle before him. "Stuck already?" Bjorn's voice carried across the hall, sharp with satisfaction. "Perhaps the great Stenfist is not so mighty when faced with work that requires thinking rather than killing." Orm's hands stilled on the mechanism, and for a moment the warrior they all knew surfaced in his pale eyes. Around the hall, men tensed, expecting the explosion of violence that usually followed such provocations. Bjorn himself seemed to realize he might have pushed too far, his hand drifting unconsciously toward his weapon. But instead of anger, Orm drew upon the deeper well of patience his father had taught him to find. "My father once told me," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed hall, "that a man who mocks another's honest effort reveals more about his own limitations than his target's abilities." The rebuke, delivered without heat or threat, somehow carried more weight than any show of violence could have managed. Bjorn's face flushed with embarrassment, and several of his friends looked away. Uncomfortable with their companion's breach of courtesy, Orm returned his attention to the lock, and after several more minutes of patient manipulation, felt the fourth ring click into its proper position. 3 rings remained, each one promising to be more challenging than the last, but something had fundamentally changed in both the man and the watching crowd. This was no longer simply entertainment. It had become something approaching ritual, a test that would define not just Orm's capabilities, but perhaps his very identity. The 5th ring proved to be the most complex yet, its surface bearing symbols that seemed to shift in the firelight like living things. As Orm studied the intricate markings, his weathered hands unconsciously reached into his worn leather satchel, withdrawing a small piece of metal that caught the flame's glow. It was nothing more than a bent nail, twisted into an unusual spiral pattern, yet something about its shape seemed to resonate with the lock's design. "What is that trinket?" Astrid asked, her voice soft with curiosity rather than mockery. Orm held the piece up to the light, his pale eyes distant with memory. "Something I shaped as a child," he admitted, his deep voice carrying an unexpected vulnerability. "My father found me bending nails in the forge one morning, creating patterns that served no purpose save beauty. He kept this one, said it showed I understood metal's willingness to flow when treated with respect rather than force. The bent nail was no larger than a man's thumb, its spiral curves perfectly balanced despite their apparent randomness. Where most would see only a ruined fastener, Orm's young hands had discovered something approaching art, proof that even then he had possessed an intuitive understanding of how metal could be coaxed into forms that pleased the eye while serving the spirit. Elder Gunnar leaned forward in his chair, his ancient eyes studying the small artifact with growing recognition. "I knew your father," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the hall's quiet murmur. Eric the Gentle, they called him, though not to mock his strength. He could work iron like other men worked clay, shaping it to his will without ever raising his voice or his hammer in anger. The revelation sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled warriors. View had connected the legendary Stenfist with the master craftsman who had once created weapons and tools for the great Jarls of the northern coast. That such artistry could have produced such a warrior seemed impossible. Yet the evidence lay before them in Orm's careful manipulation of the lock's complex mechanism. "He taught me that metal has memory," Orm continued, his fingers tracing the bent nail's curves as he spoke. "Every blow, every fold, every moment of heat and pressure leaves its mark. Force it too quickly and it becomes brittle. Work with its nature and it becomes stronger than steel hammered by giants." As he spoke, his free hand continued its delicate exploration of the 5th ring, feeling for the subtle variations in texture that would indicate the correct sequence of movements. The lock mechanism seemed to respond to his patient approach, its resistance fading as he found the proper rhythm of rotation and pressure. Around the hall, the mood had shifted from casual entertainment to something approaching reverence. Warriors accustomed to settling disputes with axe and sword found themselves witnessing a different kind of mastery, one that required understanding rather than dominance. Even Bjorn had fallen silent, his earlier mockery replaced by grudging attention to the unfolding demonstration. "I've never seen anyone approach a lock like that," one of the younger warriors whispered to his companion. "He treats it like a living thing." His observation was more accurate than he knew. To Orm, the mechanism had indeed become something alive, a creation that responded to touch and patience with revelations about its maker's intentions. Each ring told a story about the craftsman who had shaped it, about techniques passed down through generations of masters who viewed their work as conversations with eternity. The 5th ring yielded with a sound like distant music, its movement so smooth that several watchers gasped in surprise. The mechanism's internal workings had begun to synchronize, creating harmonies that spoke of precision beyond anything the northern craftsman could imagine. Yet rather than rushing toward completion, Orm paused, his massive hands resting lightly on the device as he absorbed what it had taught him thus far. "You hesitate again," Bjorn observed, though his tone carried curiosity rather than mockery now. Do you doubt your ability to finish what you've started? Orm looked up at the young warrior, seeing in his eager face something of his own youthful impatience. Haste has no place in work like this, he replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. My father taught me that the greatest mistakes come not from lack of skill, but from allowing excitement to override understanding. The lock will open when it's ready, not before. Astrid studied the giant's weathered features, noting the transformation that had occurred since he first knelt beside the mysterious box. Where his face had once shown only the weary acceptance of a professional killer, she now saw the focused intensity of a master craftsman engaging with worthy work. His pale eyes held a light that had been absent when he first sought shelter in their hall. "Your father sounds like a wise man," she said, her musical voice carrying genuine respect. It must have been difficult to leave such teaching behind for the warrior's path. The observation struck deeper than any blade could have managed. Orm's hands stilled on the lock as memories flooded through him, the morning he had buried his tools, the years of telling himself that survival mattered more than beauty, the gradual erosion of everything his father had tried to teach him about creating rather than destroying. Wisdom and survival sometimes walk different paths, he replied, his voice heavy with old grief. A dead craftsman creates nothing, while a living warrior can at least protect what others have built. Yet here you sit, Elder Gunnar observed, his ancient voice carrying decades of accumulated understanding, proving that some knowledge refuses to die, no matter how deeply we bury it. The hands remember what the mind tries to forget. The sixth ring awaited his attention, its surface bearing symbols that seemed to reference the phases of the moon and the turning of seasons. Here was astronomy combined with artistry, requiring not just mechanical skill, but understanding of the natural forces that governed all life. Orm found himself drawing upon memories of nights spent studying the stars with his father, learning to read the sky as other men read runes. As his fingers found the proper sequence of movements, he became aware of a subtle change in the watching crowd. Where they had begun as skeptics seeking entertainment, they had gradually transformed into students witnessing mastery. Their silence held not boredom, but fascination, the recognition that they were seeing something extraordinary unfold before their eyes. The sixth ring surrendered its secrets with a soft chime, and suddenly the box's internal mechanisms could be heard working in harmony, gears turning, springs tensioning, counterweights finding their balance. Whatever lay within was stirring to life, responding to the careful sequence of openings with preparations of its own. One ring remains, Astrid breathed, her voice barely audible above the mechanism's gentle music. Orm nodded, studying the final ring with the careful attention of a man who understood that last steps often proved the most treacherous. This ring bore no symbols at all, its surface polished to mirror brightness that reflected not just the firelight, but something deeper, the patient devotion of its creator, the hope that someday someone would understand enough to reach this final challenge. The most important lessons, he whispered, echoing words his father had spoken long ago, are the ones that cannot be carved in stone or written on parchment. They must be felt with the heart and understood with the spirit. His hands moved to the final ring, and the hall held its collective breath, waiting to see whether 3 decades of buried knowledge would prove sufficient to unlock the southern mystery that had defeated every other attempt. The final ring held no visible markings, its polished surface reflecting Orm's weathered face like still water. As his fingers explored its smooth contours, he found himself remembering another of his father's teachings, one that had seemed almost mystical at the time, but now revealed itself as practical wisdom earned through decades of working with recalcitrant materials. Some challenges cannot be seen with the eyes. Eric's voice whispered across the years, as clear as if the old craftsman stood beside him. When metal offers no obvious path, you must learn to feel with your hands what your mind cannot understand. The greatest locks are opened not by force or cleverness, but by patience that borders on prayer. Beside his knee lay a smooth river stone, worn to perfect roundness by countless years of water's patient caress. His father had carried such a stone, using it to demonstrate the principles of gradual pressure and sustained effort. "See how the water shapes the hardest granite," Eric had explained, rolling the stone between his palms. "Not through violence, but through persistence gentle enough to last for centuries." Orm withdrew the teaching stone from his satchel, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. The watching crowd stirred with curiosity at this new artifact, though none dared interrupt the sacred concentration that had settled over the giant warrior. Even Bjorn remained silent, his earlier mockery replaced by something approaching awe as he witnessed the transformation of a man he thought he knew. "What guides you now?" Astrid asked softly, her voice barely disturbing the air between them. "Memory," Orm replied, his eyes closing as his fingers continued their exploration of the unmarked ring. "My father taught me that the final challenge in any worthy work comes not from complexity, but from simplicity so pure it defeats those who expect complication. This ring asks only one question: do you trust what you cannot see?" As he spoke, his hands began to move with motions that seemed almost ritualistic. The river stone traced slow circles against his palm, while his other hand maintained the lightest possible contact with the ring's surface. Where before he had sought specific mechanisms and symbols, now he searched for something more elusive: the lock's fundamental rhythm, its essential nature. The hall had grown so quiet that the storm outside seemed distant as dreams. Warriors accustomed to the clash of steel and the roar of battle found themselves holding their breath, unwilling to disturb whatever delicate process was unfolding before their eyes. This had ceased to be entertainment. It had become something approaching ceremony. Elder Gunnar watched with eyes that sparkled with recognition. In Orm's patient ritual, he saw echoes of the old ways, when craftsmen approached their work as priests approached their altars, with reverence born of understanding that some acts connected earth to heaven through the medium of human skill. Such knowledge had grown rare in recent generations, surviving only in scattered fragments passed from master to apprentice. "I remember when your father demonstrated such techniques," Gunnar said, his ancient voice carrying clearly in the hushed hall. Young men would scoff at what they called superstition until they watched impossible things yield to impossible patience. The greatest smiths understood that metal possesses something approaching spirit, and spirit responds to spirit, not to force alone. Astrid leaned forward in her chair, studying Orm's face with growing fascination. The weathered features that had seemed so grim upon his arrival now showed depths she had not suspected. Here was a man who carried within himself entire libraries of forgotten wisdom. Techniques that might have died with his father had circumstances not conspired to resurrect them. "You speak as if the lock lives," she observed. Her musical voice touched with wonder. "In a sense, it does," Orm replied, his eyes still closed, his concentration absolute. Every creation carries something of its maker's spirit, especially work crafted with love, rather than mere necessity. This lock was made by someone who understood that opening it should be an act of communion, not conquest. "He asks me to remember what it means to approach the world with reverence rather than dominance." The ring began to respond to his touch, though the movement was so subtle that only his fingertips could detect it. Unlike the previous rings, which had yielded with distinct clicks and chimes, this final challenge whispered its surrender, rotating with liquid smoothness that spoke of mechanisms more precise than anything the watchers had imagined possible. Bjorn found himself leaning forward despite his determination to remain aloof. The young warrior's world had been built around clear demonstrations of strength and skill, victories that could be measured and compared. Yet here was mastery of an entirely different order, one that rendered his usual categories meaningless. How did one measure patience? How did one compare understanding? "He makes it seem almost sacred," Bjorn murmured to his companion, unaware that his words carried clearly in the silent hall. "Perhaps it is," the other warrior replied, his eyes never leaving Orm's hands. "My grandfather used to say that watching a true master work was like witnessing magic. Except magic, you could learn if you possess the dedication to empty yourself of everything you thought you knew. The teaching stone in Orm's palm had grown warm from the constant circular motions, its smooth surface now slick with perspiration from his nervous excitement. 30 years of suppressed knowledge rushed through his consciousness. Every lesson, every demonstration, every moment of patient instruction his father had provided. The man who had taught him to listen to metal's whispered secrets, to feel the difference between resistance and invitation, to approach each challenge as an opportunity for understanding rather than domination. With infinite care, Orm applied the slightest pressure to the final ring, feeling it yield like snow beneath summer sun. The movement triggered a cascade of internal mechanisms, each component sliding into its destined position with the inevitability of water finding its course. The lock's music swelled to a crescendo that seemed to fill the hall with harmony, then faded to expectant silence. The box was open. For a long moment, nobody moved. The achievement seemed too momentous for immediate celebration, too significant for the crude responses that usually marked the end of challenges. Instead, the assembled warriors sat in stunned recognition that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just the opening of a lock, but the resurrection of a man's buried identity. Orm's hands trembled slightly as he lifted them from the device, his pale eyes opening to meet Astrid's wondering gaze. In her face, he saw reflected his own amazement at what had just transpired. Somewhere in the delicate process of opening the southern lock, he had rediscovered not just forgotten skills, but forgotten parts of himself. As Orm lifted the box's lid with reverent hands, the firelight caught the gleam of something unexpected within. Instead of the promised gold, the container held another device, smaller but infinitely more complex than the lock he had just mastered. Beneath it, wrapped in oiled leather, lay a warhammer that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The weapon's head bore engravings so intricate they hurt the eyes to follow, while its handle had been worn smooth by countless hands over generations of use. "My father's hammer," Orm breathed, his voice thick with emotion he had not felt in 3 decades. "But how?" "The southern traders spoke more truth than they knew," Elder Gunnar interrupted, his ancient eyes bright with understanding. This was never about treasure in the common sense. It was about returning what was lost to its rightful inheritor. The hammer's weight in Orm's hands brought with it a flood of memories so intense that the present moment seemed to fade like morning mist. He was 8 years old again, standing on tiptoes to reach his father's workbench, watching those patient hands shape raw metal into implements that would serve families for generations. The hammer had been Eric's masterwork, a tool so perfectly balanced that it seemed to guide itself to precisely the right spot with exactly the right force. "After the raiders came," Gunnar continued, his voice heavy with old sorrow, "I retrieved what I could from the ruins of your father's forge. This hammer, his teaching stones, some of his smaller tools, I gave them to the southern traders with instructions to find a worthy home. I never imagined that home would prove to be you, returned to us after all these years." The revelation struck Orm like a physical blow. All this time, he had believed his father's legacy destroyed, reduced to ash and bitter memory. Yet here was proof that love could transcend death, that careful planning could preserve what seemed lost forever. The hammer in his hands represented not just a tool, but a bridge across decades of separation and grief. "He knew," Orm whispered, understanding flooding through him like dawn breaking over the sea. "Even dying, he knew someday I would need to remember who I was meant to be." The smaller device within the box proved to be a miniature forge, complete with bellows no larger than a child's fist and a heating chamber that could be fueled with charcoal or wood shavings. Its construction displayed the same impossible precision as the lock, every component fitted with tolerances that spoke of master craftsmen working at the very limits of their art. "A portable forge," Astrid marveled, her musician's eye recognizing the harmony of form and function. "Someone planned for this moment with extraordinary care." Orm set the tiny forge on the nearby table, his weathered hands moving with newfound confidence as he examined its mechanisms. Unlike the lock, which had required patient exploration to understand, this device seemed to welcome his touch, as if recognizing the hands that had learned their skills from the same source as its creation. "My father spoke of such things," he said, his deep voice carrying wonder at the memory. "Tools made by the Guild of Master Craftsmen, created not for commerce, but for the preservation of knowledge. Each piece designed to teach as well as serve, carrying within its structure the accumulated wisdom of generations." As he spoke, his hands began preparing the miniature forge with motions that seemed to bypass conscious thought entirely. Muscle memory reached across 30 years of suppression, guiding his movements with the certainty of water finding its course. The familiar ritual of preparation, arranging fuel, adjusting airflow, checking the condition of each component, brought with it a peace he had forgotten existed. Bjorn watched from his place near the fire, his face showing the confusion of a man whose fundamental assumptions were being challenged. The warrior he had known as Stenfist was dissolving before his eyes, replaced by someone who moved with the quiet confidence of a master returning to his calling. The transformation was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. "What will you make?" the young warrior asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than mockery. Orm paused in his preparations, his pale eyes focusing on Bjorn with something approaching compassion. Here was another young man who had chosen the warrior's path, perhaps for similar reasons of survival and necessity. In Bjorn's eager face, Orm saw echoes of his own younger self, all hunger for glory and recognition, not yet understanding that the greatest victories often came without witnesses or applause. "Something useful," Orm replied, reaching into his satchel to withdraw a piece of iron no larger than his thumb. "My father taught me that the measure of a craftsman lies not in the grandeur of his commissions, but in the care he brings to the smallest tasks. He used to say that if you cannot make a perfect nail, you have no business attempting a sword." The iron went into the forge's tiny chamber, where flames so concentrated they seemed almost solid began their work of transformation. As the metal heated, changing from black to cherry red to brilliant orange, Orm found himself explaining techniques that had been passed down through his family for generations. "Iron has moods like people," he said, his voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher sharing fundamental truths. "Heat it too quickly and it becomes brittle with shock. Work it while too hot and it loses strength. But find the perfect moment, when the color tells you it's ready to change but not yet. Committed to any particular form, and it becomes more willing than clay in a potter's hands." Astrid found herself drawn into the rhythm of his explanation, recognizing in his approach something similar to her own experience with music. Both crafts required the ability to sense invisible qualities. The precise moment when metal reached perfect working temperature was like the instant when a song's harmony achieved perfect balance. "You speak as if you love the metal itself," she observed, her musical voice carrying genuine fascination. "I do," Orm admitted without embarrassment, his eyes never leaving the glowing iron in the forge. "My father taught me that creation requires love, not just for the final result, but for the materials themselves, for the process of transformation, for the opportunity to participate in turning raw matter into something that serves life rather than destroying it." The words hung in the air like incense, carrying with them implications that extended far beyond metalwork. Here was a philosophy of existence that stood in stark contrast to the warrior's creed of conquest and dominance, offering instead a path that led toward building rather than tearing down. The iron reached perfect working temperature as Astrid moved closer to watch Orm's demonstration. Around her neck hung a silver pendant, delicately wrought in the shape of intertwining vines that caught and reflected the forge's glow. She had worn it since childhood, a gift from her mother that represented the only beauty she possessed that had nothing to do with political alliances or strategic marriages. "May I see that?" Orm asked, his eyes drawn to the pendant's craftsmanship. "The silver work is exquisite." Astrid hesitated for a moment, then lifted the chain over her head, placing the delicate piece in his weathered palm. As he examined it, his expression grew thoughtful, recognizing techniques that spoke of masters trained in the same traditions as his father. This was made by someone who understood that strength and beauty need not be enemies, he said, his deep voice carrying newfound appreciation. See how the vines seem to grow naturally, yet each curve has been carefully planned to support the whole. This is what happens when force serves vision rather than the other way around. My mother commissioned it from a traveling craftsman, Astrid replied, her musical voice touched with memory. She said it would remind me that a woman could be both strong and graceful, that I need not choose between power and beauty. Orm nodded, understanding flowing between them like current in a river. Here was someone else who had struggled with the false choices imposed by a world that saw only extremes, warrior or weakling, ruler or ruled, strength or sensitivity. In her green eyes, he saw recognition of the burden that came with being expected to fit into categories too narrow to contain a complete human being. Your mother was wise, he said, returning the pendant with care that bordered on reverence. The world teaches us to see opposition where nature shows only harmony. A tree must be both flexible enough to bend in storms and strong enough to stand against them. Why should people be any different? Bjorn shifted uncomfortably near the fire, his dark eyes showing the confusion of a young man whose certainties were crumbling beneath philosophical challenges he had never considered. All his life, he had believed that strength meant the ability to impose his will on others, that leadership came from demonstrating superior force. Yet here was Orm, clearly the strongest man in the hall, speaking of cooperation and balance as if they were martial virtues. But surely, Bjorn interjected, his voice carrying the edge of someone defending core beliefs. There are times when force is the only answer, when enemies threaten everything we hold dear. Orm removed the heated iron from the forge, setting it on the tiny anvil that had been concealed within the portable device. As he reached for his father's hammer, its familiar weight seemed to settle something within him that had been restless for decades. Of course, he replied, beginning the rhythmic work of shaping the glowing metal. But even then, the question becomes whether we apply force with wisdom or merely with anger. A sword forged in rage will shatter when it meets one crafted with patience and understanding. Each hammer blow rang like a bell in the quiet hall, the sound carrying harmonies that spoke of perfect timing and precise control. Where another man might have attacked the iron with brutal efficiency, Orm coaxed it into new shapes through measured strikes that built upon each other like notes in a complex song. "Watch the metal," he instructed, his voice taking on the patient tone of a master sharing fundamental knowledge. "See how it responds differently to quick strikes versus slow ones. Hard blows create resistance, but gentle persistence creates willing cooperation. The strongest steel comes from iron that has been persuaded to change, not beaten into submission." Astrid found herself mesmerized by the demonstration, recognizing parallels to her own struggles with leadership expectations. Her father ruled through a combination of strength and cunning that had served their people well, but lately she had sensed growing restlessness among the younger warriors, men like Bjorn, who respected only displays of raw power and grew impatient with diplomatic solutions. "The same principles apply to leading people," she observed, her insight drawing approving nods from Elder Gunnar. "Force them to obey, and they wait for the first opportunity to rebel. Help them understand why your way serves their interests, and they become willing partners." "Exactly," Orm agreed, his hammer shaping the iron into what was clearly becoming a delicate flower, something beautiful and entirely unnecessary for survival. "My father used to say that the difference between a tyrant and a leader is that tyrants make people do things, while leaders help people want to do them." The philosophical discussion continued as Orm worked, the rhythm of hammer on iron providing a steady counterpoint to ideas that challenged every assumption the watching warriors held about strength and leadership. Some, like Bjorn, struggled visibly with concepts that undermined their understanding of how the world worked. Others, particularly the older men who had seen the costs of endless conflict, listened with growing interest to suggestions that power might be wielded with something other than brutality. Elder Gunnar watched the unfolding scene with satisfaction that had nothing to do with the successful opening of the lock. Here was something he had hoped for, but never expected to witness: the resurrection of philosophical traditions that had once made their people great, not just in war, but in the arts of peace that sustained civilization between conflicts. "Your father would be proud," he told Orm, his ancient voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. He always believed that true strength lay in the ability to choose the appropriate response, rather than relying on the only response you knew. "You have proven tonight that such wisdom can survive even decades of necessary violence." The iron flower took final shape under Orm's careful attention, its petals so delicate they seemed to flutter in the forge's heat. When he finally set down the hammer, the assembled warriors stared at the creation with expressions ranging from wonder to confusion. Here was proof that the hands capable of crushing skulls could also craft beauty that would outlast any victory won through force alone. "For you," Orm said simply, offering the flower to Astrid. "A reminder that strength and beauty can dwell in the same hands, serve the same heart." As she accepted the gift, their fingers touched briefly, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with political alliances or strategic considerations. Here was recognition of kindred spirits. Two people who understood that the world's complexity required responses more nuanced than the crude categories most people accepted without question. As Astrid accepted the iron flower with trembling hands, something extraordinary occurred. The delicate petals, still warm from their shaping, began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with residual heat from the forge. Where her fingers touched the metal, intricate patterns emerged, symbols that matched those on the mysterious lock, flowing across the flower's surface like living script. The hall erupted in gasps of amazement as the flower's glow intensified, revealing a hidden compartment within the lockbox that none had noticed before. The secret section opened with a soft chime, revealing not gold or silver, but a scroll wrapped in silk that seemed to shimmer with its own luminescence. "By the gods," Elder Gunnar breathed, his ancient hands shaking as he reached for the revealed document. "This bears the seal of the Guild of Master Craftsmen, a mark that has not been seen in the Northern Lands for more than 50 years. As he unrolled the scroll, symbols appeared that seemed to shift and change in the flickering light. The text was written in the old tongue, the formal language of treaties and ceremonies that few still remembered how to read. But Gunnar's eyes brightened with recognition as he began to translate the ancient words. "It is a testament," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of profound discovery. A challenge issued by the southern guilds to find one worthy of inheriting the old knowledge, not just the techniques of working metal, but the deeper wisdom of leadership that comes from understanding rather than domination. Orm felt the world tilt beneath him as the true scope of the evening's events became clear. This had never been about entertainment or simple treasure. From the moment he had knelt beside the mysterious box, forces had been moving that reached back generations, connecting him to a destiny his father had prepared him for without his knowledge. "The lock was merely the first test," Gunnar continued, his voice growing stronger as he absorbed the scroll's implications. "Opening it required not just skill, but the proper spirit, someone who approached challenges with patience rather than force, who understood that true strength comes from harmony rather than conquest." Astrid's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "You knew," she said, turning to face her father with a mixture of accusation and wonder. "You knew what this really was when the traders brought it." Jarl Thrain's weathered face showed no surprise at his daughter's insight. Instead, he nodded slowly, his expression carrying the weight of carefully kept secrets. The southern guilds have been seeking someone worthy to inherit their accumulated knowledge for decades. When their agents brought word of a giant warrior who bore the name Stenfist, son of Eric the Gentle, they asked me to arrange a test that would reveal whether the craftsman's soul survived beneath the warrior's scars. The revelation hit Orm like a physical blow. Every assumption he had made about chance and coincidence crumbled as he realized the extent of the planning that had brought him to this moment. His arrival at Fjallvik during the storm, the presence of the mysterious box, even Elder Gunnar's careful preservation of his father's tools, all had been orchestrated by forces that understood the larger picture far better than he had imagined. But why? He asked, his deep voice barely above a whisper. Why go to such lengths for one man who abandoned his calling decades ago? Gunnar's ancient eyes sparkled with something approaching joy as he prepared to reveal the scroll's deepest secret. Because the guild foresaw what is coming, he replied, his words carrying the weight of prophecy. Times have changed when the old ways of ruling through force alone will no longer suffice. They sought not just a craftsman, but a leader who could unite the skills of war with the wisdom of peace, someone who understood that true strength comes from building rather than destroying. The flower in Astrid's hands pulsed with brighter light, its glow revealing additional text that appeared like writing emerging from invisible ink. As the words became clear, even those who could not read the old tongue understood that they were witnessing something momentous. It speaks of a confederation, Gunnar translated, his voice hushed with awe. An alliance of northern and southern peoples, united not through conquest, but through shared understanding of principles that transcend cultural differences. The guild offers their accumulated knowledge, techniques of craftsmanship, methods of governance, traditions of justice, to any who prove worthy to receive them. Bjorn lurched to his feet, his face flushed with anger and confusion. "This is madness," he declared, his voice cracking with the strain of having his world overturned. "We are warriors, not philosophers. Our strength comes from steel and courage, not from bending over forges like common smiths." His outburst revealed the fear that lay beneath his mockery, the terror of a young man who had built his identity around narrow definitions of strength and found those definitions crumbling beneath the weight of broader possibilities. In his desperate words, the assembled warriors heard echoes of their own uncertainties about change that challenged everything they thought they knew about leadership and power. Orm rose slowly, his massive frame casting long shadows in the firelight. When he turned to face Bjorn, his pale eyes held not anger, but compassion for someone struggling with the same choices that had once torn him apart. "I thought as you do once," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute sincerity. "I believed that abandoning my father's teachings made me stronger, that choosing war over creation proved my worthiness as a man. But tonight has shown me that true strength lies not in rejecting who we were meant to be, but in integrating all our capabilities into something larger than either alone." The words hung in the air like challenge and invitation combined. Around the hall, warriors found themselves confronting questions they had never considered: whether strength could include gentleness, whether leadership might require understanding as well as authority, whether their people's future lay in expanding their definition of what it meant to be powerful. Astrid stepped forward, the glowing flower still cradled in her palms. "The scroll speaks not just of confederation, but of transformation," she said, her musical voice carrying new authority. "It offers knowledge that could make our people great in ways that transcend mere military conquest, techniques for working metal that could revolutionize our tools and weapons, methods of governance that could bring stability without oppression, traditions of justice that could end the cycle of endless vengeance that has plagued our lands for generations." As she spoke, the flower's light intensified until it seemed to fill the entire hall with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire blazing in the central pit. In that supernatural radiance, every face showed clearly, some bright with possibility, Others shadowed with fear of change, all marked by the recognition that this night had become a turning point that would reshape not just their understanding of leadership, but their vision of what their people might become. The hidden compartment revealed one final artifact, a ring bearing the guild's seal, sized perfectly for Orm's massive hand. As he lifted it from its resting place, the metal seemed to recognize his touch, warming with the same inner light that suffused the flower. Here was proof of acceptance, tangible evidence that the Southern Masters considered him worthy of inheriting knowledge that had been preserved across generations for this very moment. The guild seal ring fit Orm's massive finger as if it had been forged specifically for him, its ancient metal warming against his skin, with recognition that transcended mere physical contact. As he studied the intricate engravings that covered its surface, symbols began to glow with the same inner light that suffused Astrid's flower, revealing layers of meaning that spoke of responsibilities far greater than anything he had imagined when he first knelt beside the mysterious box. "With acceptance comes obligation," Elder Gunnar intoned, his ancient voice carrying the weight of ritual formula passed down through generations. "The guild's knowledge is not a treasure to be hoarded, but a trust to be shared with those ready to embrace transformation. Are you prepared to become not just a craftsman, but a bridge between old ways and new possibilities?" The question hung in the air like incense, demanding an answer that would reshape not just Orm's destiny, but the future of everyone in the hall. Around the fire, warriors who had begun the evening seeking simple entertainment found themselves confronting choices that would define their children's inheritance. The comfortable certainties of their familiar world were dissolving, replaced by opportunities that promised growth beyond anything their traditions had envisioned. Bjorn paced near the far wall like a caged wolf, his agitation growing with each revelation that challenged his fundamental beliefs about strength and leadership. "This is betrayal of everything our ancestors died to protect," he declared, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "We are being asked to abandon the warrior's path for foreign philosophies that will make us weak before our enemies." Several younger warriors nodded agreement, their faces showing the same fear that drove Bjorn's opposition. They had built their identities around narrow definitions of courage and honor that left no room for the complexities being revealed. To them, Orm's transformation represented not evolution, but corruption, the contamination of pure strength with alien concepts that threatened everything they understood about what made a man worthy of respect. Astrid watched the developing tension with growing concern, recognizing that the evening's revelations had created a fundamental divide within their community. On one side stood those who saw opportunity in the guild's offer, older warriors who had witnessed the costs of endless conflict, craftsmen who understood the value of preserved knowledge, women who grasped the implications of leadership based on understanding rather than dominance. On the other side gathered those who equated change with weakness, who viewed any deviation from traditional methods as surrender to foreign influence. "We stand at a crossroads," she said, her musical voice cutting through the rising murmur of conflicting opinions. "We can choose to remain as we have always been, strong in our familiar ways but limited by their boundaries. Or we can risk becoming something larger, a people who unite the warrior's courage with the craftsman's wisdom, who lead through inspiration rather than intimidation alone." Her words sparked heated discussion as warriors debated the implications of accepting the guild's offer. Some argued that their strength had always come from unity of purpose, that introducing foreign concepts would create divisions that enemies could exploit. Others contended that adapting to changing times required embracing new possibilities, that stagnation led inevitably to defeat by more flexible opponents. Jarl Thrain listened to the debate with the careful attention of a leader who understood that his next words would influence generations. The decision before them reached far beyond simple questions of alliance or resistance. It touched the very heart of what kind of people they chose to become. In the guild's offer, he recognized both tremendous opportunity and genuine danger, possibilities for growth balanced against risks of losing essential identity. "The scroll speaks of more than philosophy," he announced, his authoritative voice commanding attention from every corner of the hall. "It describes specific techniques that could revolutionize our weapons, our tools, our methods of building and defending. The southern guilds possess knowledge of metallurgy that could make our warriors' equipment superior to anything our enemies possess. Are we so proud that we reject advantages that could protect our children's lives?" The practical arguments carried weight even with the most traditional warriors. None could deny that their current methods, while sufficient for survival, left room for improvement. The prospect of superior weapons and tools appealed to men whose lives depended on the reliability of their equipment. Yet beneath their growing interest lay persistent worry about the cost of such advantages. Elder Gunnar rose from his chair, his ancient frame carrying dignity that commanded respect from even the youngest warriors. "I have lived long enough to witness many changes," he said, his voice growing stronger as he drew upon 8 decades of accumulated wisdom. "I have seen peoples who adapted flourish, while those who refused change withered into insignificance. The choice before us is not between strength and weakness, but between rigid strength that breaks under pressure and flexible strength that bends without breaking." As the debate continued, Orm found himself studying the ring on his finger with growing understanding of what acceptance would require. The guild's offer came with obligations that extended far beyond personal transformation. He would become responsible for bridging cultures that had regarded each other with suspicion for generations, for translating ancient wisdom into forms that northern warriors could accept without feeling diminished. "What guarantees do we have?" Bjorn demanded, his voice carrying the desperate edge of a man fighting for beliefs that defined his existence. "How do we know this is not some elaborate trap designed to weaken us before conquest? The southern kingdoms have long coveted our territories and trade routes. The challenge struck at the heart of everyone's concerns. Trust between cultures required leaps of faith that could prove catastrophic if misjudged. Yet the alternatives, continued isolation, gradual stagnation, eventual defeat by more adaptable peoples, carried their own dangers that could prove equally destructive to everything they valued. Astrid stepped forward, the glowing flower in her hands pulsing with increased brightness as she prepared to reveal her own role in the evening's events. "Because I have been in contact with the guild's agents for months," she announced, her words sending shockwaves through the assembled warriors. "They sought someone who could serve as intermediary, someone trusted by our people, but capable of understanding broader perspectives. They offered not conquest, but partnership, not submission, but mutual growth." The revelation that Jarl Thrain's daughter had been conducting secret negotiations sent the hall into an uproar. Warriors who had accepted her presence as natural suddenly saw her in an entirely different light, not merely the Jarl's child, but an active participant in reshaping their world's future. Some viewed her initiative as bold leadership, while others saw it as dangerous overreach that exceeded proper authority. "You had no right," Bjorn snarled, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "These are decisions for warriors to make, not children playing at politics they cannot understand." The insult hung in the air like drawn steel, crossing boundaries that even heated debate should respect. Around the hall, men tensed as they recognized that the evening's philosophical discussions were approaching a moment of potential violence. Orm rose slowly, his massive frame blocking the space between Bjorn and Astrid with deliberate intent. "Choose your next words carefully," he said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who had killed many men and felt no reluctance about adding another to the count. "Wisdom is not determined by age or gender, but by the quality of understanding brought to complex problems. If you cannot debate ideas without resorting to personal attacks, perhaps you lack the maturity to participate in decisions that will affect generations." The confrontation crystallized everything the evening had revealed about changing definitions of strength and leadership. Here was the legendary Stenfist, defending not just a woman, but the principle that leadership required qualities beyond mere physical dominance. His willingness to protect intellectual discourse, with physical force if necessary, demonstrated the integration of warrior skills with broader understanding that the guild's offer promised to cultivate. Tension filled the hall, like smoke from green wood, as the two warriors faced each other across an ideological divide that seemed unbridgeable. The moment balanced on knife's edge, waiting for someone to choose between the path of violence that had always settled their disputes and the more difficult road of finding solutions that preserved both honor and wisdom, the ancient key to resolving. Their conflict lay not in weapons or words, but in understanding the sequence of movements that would unlock deeper wisdom within their divided community. As Orm stood between Bjorn and Astrid, he realized that this moment demanded not the warrior's reflexive violence, but the craftsman's patient precision, each action carefully calculated to guide opposing forces toward harmony rather than destruction. "There is another way," he said, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a sword through silk. "The guild's traditions speak of tests that prove worthiness through demonstration rather than declaration. If Bjorn questions the value of what we have discovered tonight, let him witness its practical application." Elder Gunnar's ancient eyes brightened with understanding as he recognized the wisdom of Orm's approach. "A proving ground," he said, his voice carrying approval earned through decades of watching conflicts resolved through contests of skill rather than bloodshed. "Let those who doubt see evidence of what integration can accomplish." Astrid stepped forward, the glowing flower in her hands pulsing with increased radiance as she grasped the implications of Orm's suggestion. Here was an opportunity to bridge the growing divide within their community through demonstration that would convince even the most skeptical warriors of the guild's offer's practical value. "What do you propose?" Jarl Thrain asked, his authoritative voice carrying genuine curiosity about how ancient wisdom might manifest in contemporary challenges. Orm moved to the table where his father's tools lay scattered around the miniature forge, his weathered hands selecting implements that seemed to sing with recognition at his touch. "Bjorn speaks of strength through traditional methods," he said, his voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher preparing a crucial lesson. "I propose we test whether innovation can enhance rather than replace such strength." The challenge he outlined was elegantly simple in concept, yet profoundly complex in execution. 2 blades would be forged, one using traditional northern techniques that Bjorn understood completely, the other incorporating southern methods that the guild's knowledge made possible. Both weapons would be crafted from identical materials under identical conditions, with only the approaches differing. The resulting blades would then be tested not just for sharpness and durability, but for the subtle qualities that mark truly superior weapons. "I accept," Bjorn declared immediately, his dark eyes bright with eagerness to prove that foreign innovations could not improve upon methods perfected by generations of northern smiths. "Let us see whether your southern mysteries can create anything superior to honest northern steel." The hall erupted in excited conversation as warriors grasped the implications of the proposed contest. Here was a test that would provide concrete evidence about the value of the guild's offer, settling philosophical debates through practical demonstration that everyone could understand. Those who had felt overwhelmed by abstract discussions of leadership and integration found relief in a challenge that promised clear, measurable results. Astrid watched the preparations with growing anticipation, recognizing that this contest represented more than simple competition between techniques. The outcome would influence not just individual opinions, but the entire community's willingness to embrace transformation that could reshape their future. In many ways, the next few hours would determine whether her people chose evolution or stagnation. Orm began his preparations with ritualistic care, arranging his father's tools with the reverence of a priest preparing for ceremony. Each implement seemed to carry its own significance: hammers worn smooth by decades of use, tongs shaped to fit specific purposes, files and stones that could coax precision from the roughest work. As he handled them, muscle memory reached across 30 years of suppression, guiding his movements with certainty that bypassed conscious thought. The iron he selected for his blade came from the same source as Bjorn's, ensuring that any differences in the final products could be attributed only to technique rather than materials. Yet even in this simple selection, distinctions emerged. Where Bjorn chose his metal based on obvious qualities, color, weight, apparent purity, Orm spent long minutes examining pieces that looked identical to untrained eyes, feeling for subtle variations that spoke of internal structure and hidden potential. "He treats the iron like a living thing," one warrior murmured to his companion, his voice carrying wonder at the careful attention Orm devoted to preliminary tasks that others would have completed in moments. The observation was more accurate than its speaker realized. To Orm, the metal did possess something approaching life, not consciousness in any human sense, but responsiveness that rewarded understanding while punishing ignorance. His father had taught him to feel for the stress patterns within seemingly uniform pieces, to recognize the grain structures that would determine how each section responded to heat and pressure. As both smiths began heating their respective pieces of iron, the fundamental differences in their approaches became immediately apparent. Bjorn attacked the work with aggressive efficiency, applying heat and force with the straightforward methods that had served northern smiths adequately for generations. His technique was neither wrong nor ineffective. It would produce a serviceable weapon that could serve a warrior well in battle. Orm's method revealed itself as something altogether more complex. Where Bjorn sought to impose his will upon resistant material, Orm began a conversation with metal that seemed eager to cooperate once its nature was properly understood. His heating patterns followed rhythms that built upon each other like movements in a symphony, each phase preparing the iron for transformations that would have been impossible under cruder treatment. The Master's Testament revealed itself not in written words but in the living demonstration of principles that transformed raw metal into something approaching art. As Orm's blade took shape under his patient hammer strokes, the assembled warriors witnessed the emergence of steel that seemed to possess qualities beyond anything their traditional methods could achieve. The weapon's edge gleamed with patterns that flowed like water frozen in motion, while its surface bore the subtle ripples that marked truly superior metallurgy. Bjorn's blade, forged with competent but conventional techniques, stood as solid proof that northern methods could produce serviceable weapons. His sword would cut cleanly, hold its edge reasonably well, and serve its wielder faithfully in battle. By any traditional measure, he had succeeded in creating exactly what such work was meant to accomplish, a tool adequate for its intended purpose. Yet when the two weapons lay side by side, even untrained eyes could perceive the difference. Orm's blade seemed to capture and reflect light in ways that made it appear almost alive, its surface patterns suggesting depths that invited closer study. Where Bjorn's sword spoke of honest craftsmanship applied to familiar challenges, Orm's weapon whispered of possibilities that transcended mere function to approach genuine artistry. "Now we test," Elder Gunnar announced, his ancient voice carrying the authority of one who had witnessed many such contests over 8 decades of life. "Let us see which approach produces superior results when subjected to the demands that matter in the real world." The testing began with simple trials that any warrior could understand, cutting through various materials, holding an edge under stress, maintaining balance during complex maneuvers. Both blades performed admirably in these basic evaluations, confirming that neither smith had produced anything inferior to normal standards. But as the tests grew more demanding, subtle differences began to emerge. Orm's blade cut through tough materials with less effort, as if its edge possessed keenness that went beyond mere sharpness. When struck against hard surfaces that would notch ordinary steel, it rang like a bell while showing no visible damage. Most remarkably, it seemed to guide itself toward optimal cutting angles, as if the weapon's balance had been calculated to assist rather than merely accommodate its wielder's intentions. "By the gods!" Bjorn breathed, his voice thick with wonder and dismay as he witnessed his cherished beliefs crumbling before irrefutable evidence. "How is such perfection possible?" Orm set down his father's hammer, his weathered face showing satisfaction that had nothing to do with victory over an opponent and everything to do with successful resurrection of nearly lost knowledge. "Because the southern techniques do not replace what we know," he explained, his deep voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher sharing fundamental truths. "They complete it. Your methods provide the strength that makes a weapon functional. The guild's knowledge adds the understanding that makes it exceptional. The demonstration had accomplished more than settling a contest between competing techniques. In the space of a few hours, the entire community had witnessed transformation that challenged every assumption they held about the relationship between tradition and innovation. The guild's offer no longer seemed like foreign contamination of pure northern strength, but rather like missing pieces that could complete patterns their ancestors had begun, but never finished. Astrid stepped forward, the glowing flower still cradled in her hands, pulsing with light that seemed to respond to the community's growing unity of purpose. "This is what partnership offers," she said, her musical voice carrying new authority earned through successful navigation of dangerous political waters. "Not the replacement of our identity, but its enhancement through knowledge that makes us more than we could become alone." Bjorn knelt before the superior blade with the grace of a warrior who recognized defeat without shame. His earlier anger transformed into something approaching gratitude. "I spoke from fear," he admitted, his voice carrying the strength that comes from acknowledging error without surrendering dignity. "Fear that change would diminish what made us strong. But I see now that true strength lies in embracing growth rather than clinging to limitations." The moment of his surrender to evidence marked the turning point that transformed philosophical possibility into practical commitment. Around the hall, warriors who had watched the contest with growing amazement found their resistance to the guild's offer dissolving like frost under spring sun. Here was proof that accepting new knowledge need not require abandoning cherished traditions, but could instead fulfill their highest potential. Jarl Thrain rose from his chair with the dignity of a leader who had successfully guided his people through treacherous waters toward calmer seas. "Then it is decided," he announced, his authoritative voice carrying absolute conviction. "We accept the guild's offer and commit ourselves to the path of integration they have made possible. Orm Stenfist shall serve as our bridge to this new knowledge, bearing the responsibility of ensuring that what we gain strengthens rather than corrupts what we are." The scroll's testament had been fulfilled not through words but through demonstration that convinced even the most skeptical observers. As the hall erupted in cheers of approval, the glowing artifacts pulsed with increased radiance, as if responding to the community's unanimous embrace of transformation that promised to reshape their world's future. The evening that had begun with simple entertainment had become the foundation for changes that would echo through generations yet unborn. The new hall's foundation stone lay beneath the morning sun 6 months later, its surface bearing engravings that told the story of transformation accomplished through wisdom rather than conquest. Where once had stood only Jarl Thrain's traditional stronghold, now rose a structure that embodied the integration of northern strength with southern sophistication. Walls built to endure, yet carved with beauty that lifted the spirit. Defensive positions that protected while welcoming those who came in peace. Orm knelt beside the foundation stone with hands that bore new calluses earned through months of building rather than battling, his weathered fingers tracing symbols that represented the marriage of two traditions into something greater than either alone could have achieved. The guild's knowledge had indeed transformed their capabilities, but not through replacement of cherished ways, rather through completion of patterns their ancestors had begun without fully understanding their potential. The traders arrived tomorrow, Astrid observed, approaching with steps that carried the confidence of a leader who had successfully guided her people through profound change without losing their essential identity. Around her neck hung the iron flower Orm had crafted on that transformative night, now polished to gleam like silver, yet retaining the strength that only northern iron could provide. Representatives from 7 kingdoms, all seeking to understand how we achieved such remarkable prosperity in so short a time. The transformation had exceeded even the guild's optimistic projections. Weapons forged using integrated techniques had proven so superior that neighboring peoples had begun offering substantial payments for access to similar craftsmanship. Tools created through combined knowledge had revolutionized their farming and building methods, creating surplus wealth that allowed expansion of trade networks previously beyond their reach. More significantly, the philosophical principles that guided their technical innovations had begun reshaping their approach to governance and conflict resolution. Disputes that once would have required blood for settlement now found resolution through patient negotiation that sought understanding rather than domination. The strength they had always possessed remained intact, but now served wisdom rather than mere survival instincts. "What will you tell them?" Orm asked, rising from his examination of the foundation stone with movements that reflected the integration of warrior's readiness with craftsman's deliberate precision. 6 months of embracing his dual nature had transformed him from a man divided against himself into someone who embodied the harmony that made their new society possible. "The truth," Astrid replied, her musical voice carrying the authority she had earned through successful leadership during their period of greatest change. "That strength without wisdom leads only to temporary victories, while wisdom without strength cannot protect what matters most. But together they create possibilities that neither could achieve alone." Bjorn emerged from the construction site where he had been overseeing the installation of defenses that incorporated both traditional northern fortification principles and southern engineering innovations that made their walls nearly impregnable. His transformation from skeptical opponent to enthusiastic advocate had become one of the most inspiring aspects of their community's evolution. "The young warriors want to know when you'll begin the advanced training," he reported, his voice carrying the eager anticipation that had replaced his former resentment. "They've mastered the basic integration techniques, but they're hungry for the deeper knowledge you promised would come with proper foundation." Orm smiled at the irony that the man who had once mocked his approach now served as his most dedicated student and advocate. Bjorn's natural leadership abilities, freed from the limitations of narrow thinking, had made him invaluable in teaching younger warriors that true strength came from expanding rather than restricting their capabilities. "Tomorrow," Orm replied, his deep voice carrying satisfaction at how far they all had traveled from that storm-lashed night when everything had seemed fixed and unchangeable. "The foundation is solid enough now to support more complex structures. They're ready to learn techniques that will make them not just better fighters, but better leaders of the generation that comes after them." Elder Gunnar approached with steps that seemed lighter than his 8 decades should have allowed, his ancient eyes bright with the joy that came from witnessing dreams fulfilled beyond his most optimistic hopes. In his weathered hands, he carried scrolls that had arrived with the latest guild, messengers, reports from other communities that had begun implementing similar integration programs with equally remarkable results. "The Confederation grows," he announced, his voice carrying wonder at developments that exceeded the most ambitious projections. 12 kingdoms have now committed to the principles we've proven work. The Guild estimates that within 5 years, half the known world will have adopted methods that prioritize understanding alongside strength." The implications were staggering. What had begun as a simple challenge to open a mysterious lock had become the foundation for transformation that promised to reshape civilization itself. The cycle of endless conflict that had plagued their lands for generations was giving way to cooperation based on mutual recognition that everyone benefited when wisdom guided strength, toward building rather than destroying. As the sun reached its zenith, casting the new hall's shadow across the foundation stone, Orm reflected on the journey that had brought him from broken warrior to integrated leader. The man who had arrived seeking shelter from a storm had discovered not just refuge, but redemption through the resurrection of gifts he had thought buried forever. The bells that called their people to the midday meal rang with harmonies that reflected the same principles that had guided the nights. Lock opening, individual voices combining into something more beautiful than any could achieve alone. In their music, Orm heard echoes of his father's patient teaching, proof that love and wisdom could indeed transcend death to guide future generations toward possibilities their creators had barely dared imagine. "The storm ends," Astrid said softly, her hand finding his as they watched their transformed community go about its business with the quiet confidence that came from understanding their place in a larger pattern. And we discover that what we thought was shelter was actually home. Around them, the foundation stone seemed to pulse with inner light, as if responding to their recognition that some storms bring not destruction, but the clearing away of obstacles that had prevented growth towards something far greater than survival alone.